It was a typical afternoon at Park Cafe, a well-known gathering spot for the city's wealthiest and most influential people. Tucked between rows of perfectly manicured trees, the cafe exuded sophistication, with waiters in crisp white uniforms weaving gracefully between tables, balancing trays of artisanal dishes and freshly brewed coffee. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and aromatic espresso, a symbol of indulgence for those who could afford such luxuries. At a prime table in the center, enjoying the ambience with calculated detachment, sat Benjamin Clark, a 74-year-old billionaire. He was a man of immense power and prestige, someone who had spent decades building an empire that stretched across real estate, finance, and elite business ventures. His gold-rimmed glasses rested atop a sharp nose, his movements deliberate, measured the kind of man who had spent a lifetime making decisions that shaped industries and lives. Despite his wealth, Benjamin looked distracted, as if the grandeur surrounding him had long since lost its charm. Across from him sat his much younger wife, Melissa, a woman who could have stepped straight out of a luxury magazine. Her jet-black hair framed a face of impossible perfection, her bright red lips curved into a smile, but there was a certain detachment behind her eyes. She exuded elegance, her diamond bracelet catching the sunlight as she twirled it absent-mindedly, but her focus wasn't on her husband. Not far from the cafe's patio fence, lingering just out of sight, was Jamal, a young black boy. His oversized hoodie hung loosely on his thin frame, his dark eyes scanning the tables, observing the plates, the people, the opportunities. He was a familiar face in this part of town, a child who had no home, no safety net, always existing on the fringes of society. He had learned how to go unnoticed, how to survive in a world that barely acknowledged him. But today, he saw something that forced him to act. A quiet betrayal unfolds. Benjamin adjusted his glasses and glanced at his watch, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Melissa offered another one of her effortless smiles, reaching across the table to place her manicured fingers gently over his. "You know how much I enjoy these lunches," she said sweetly, her voice smooth, her charm effortless. Benjamin simply nodded, though his attention had already drifted elsewhere. Jamal's stomach growled as he edged closer to the railing, his movements silent. His eyes landed on Benjamin's table, particularly on the steaming bowl of soup in front of the billionaire. It was the kind of meal he hadn't seen up close in months, rich and decadent, far removed from the scraps he was used to scavenging. But then he saw something that made his breath catch. Melissa, while her husband was momentarily distracted, reached into her designer handbag, her fingers closing around a small vial. With a casual flick of her wrist, she twisted it open, tilting her hand ever so slightly over the bowl. The liquid disappeared into the soup almost instantly, blending seamlessly as if it had never been there at all. Jamal froze. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he watched her stir the soup with her spoon, her expression unchanged, her movements practiced and deliberate. Then she leaned in slightly, her voice soft yet sharp. "After all the trouble I've gone through," she whispered, "you won't ruin this now?" Jamal's fingers clenched against the metal railing, his nails digging into his palms. He wasn't sure what he had just witnessed. Could it be real? Could a woman so polished, so beautiful, really be capable of something so sinister? His first instinct was to walk away. It wasn't his problem. Why get involved? Who would believe him? He was just a homeless kid, a nameless figure on the streets. But as his gaze returned to Benjamin, who was now reaching for his spoon, something inside him screamed no. Wrong was wrong. And if he stayed silent, this man might not live to see another day. A choice that would change everything. Jamal's chest tightened as he glanced around. No one else had noticed. The other patrons were too caught up in their own conversations, laughing over glasses of wine, discussing business deals and vacation plans. The waiters continued their routine, weaving seamlessly between tables, blissfully unaware of the act of quiet betrayal unfolding before them. Jamal swallowed hard. Benjamin's spoon hovered just inches from his lips. There was no more time to hesitate. Before he could second-guess himself, Jamal pushed off the railing, his heart pounding, his legs moving faster than his thoughts. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, how he was going to make anyone listen. But as he reached the table, his voice came out loud and clear, cutting through the polished air of the cafe like a knife. "Don't eat that." The words rippled through the cafe, stopping conversations mid-sentence. A fork clattered against a plate somewhere in the background. Every head turned in unison, confusion and curiosity flickering in their eyes. Benjamin froze, his spoon inches from his lips, his wide eyes locking onto the small, ragged figure now standing in front of him. Melissa's entire demeanor shifted. She whipped her head around, her expression darkening, hardening in an instant. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice no longer the gentle purr it had been before. Jamal didn't falter. His voice wavered slightly, but he made sure it was loud enough for everyone to hear. "She put something in your food," he said, his breath quickening. "I saw her. Don't eat it." A wave of gasps rippled through the cafe. Patrons leaned in, their curiosity turning to alarm. Benjamin's expression shifted from confusion to suspicion, his gaze flickering to Melissa, whose face had gone pale despite her carefully applied makeup. "Melissa," he said, his tone calm but sharp. "What is he talking about?" Melissa's composure snapped like a thread pulled too tight. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the stone floor, her voice turning sharp and defensive. "You little liar," she hissed, her polished veneer slipping. "How dare you accuse me of something so vile? Who even let you in here?" But Jamal stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. He had seen the truth, and he wasn't backing down. As the weight of his accusation hung heavy in the air, Benjamin's hand trembled slightly as he set his spoon back onto the table. Something deep inside him told him that this boy, this stranger, was telling the truth. And for the first time that afternoon, Melissa realized she might have just lost everything. The moment of truth, a billionaire's doubt, and a wife's deception. A heavy silence settled over Park Cafe, the once lively hum of conversation now replaced with stunned disbelief. All eyes were on Benjamin Clark, 74 years old, his spoon hovering inches from his lips, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Across from him, Melissa, his much younger wife, sat rigid, her expression frozen in a carefully crafted mask of indignation and shock. And then there was Jamal, the young black boy who had shattered the illusion of a perfect afternoon. He stood firm, his chest heaving, his hands clenched at his sides. He had spent his whole life on the fringes of society, ignored and overlooked, but at this moment, he had every pair of eyes in the cafe locked on him. "She put something in your food," he repeated, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his fingers. "I saw her. Don't eat it." A murmur rippled through the crowd, whispers floating between elegantly dressed patrons. The words poison, liar, and mistake mixed with the clinking of silverware and the shifting of chairs. Benjamin's sharp, calculating mind began processing the situation like a business deal gone wrong. His instincts, the very instincts that had built his billion-dollar empire, told him something wasn't right. He had known Melissa for years, but lately, something about her had changed. She had been more distant, more secretive, her affection feeling more like a performance than genuine care. There were whispers in his mind that he had ignored for months, small inconsistencies, late-night phone calls, unexplained absences, but he had dismissed them. And now here he was, holding a spoonful of soup that a street kid had just warned him not to eat. Melissa's attempt to control the narrative. Melissa's chair scraped against the floor as she stood abruptly, her designer handbag swinging at her side. Her expression was a mix of fury and forced composure, the kind worn by people who are used to controlling the situation but suddenly find themselves losing their grip. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice sharper than before. "He's just some street kid trying to cause trouble." "Bernard, you're really going to believe this nonsense?" But Benjamin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he set his spoon down deliberately, his fingers drumming against the edge of the table. His gaze flickered between Melissa and Jamal, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like an anvil. "Tell me exactly what you saw, son," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. Melissa let out a harsh laugh, her frustration barely concealed. "You're really going to entertain this, Benjamin? Look at him. He's probably just looking for money." But Benjamin held up a hand, silencing her. His eyes were locked on Jamal, who took a deep breath before speaking. "She had a small bottle, like the kind you use for medicine," Jamal explained, his voice firm but careful. "She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking. Then she stirred it. And after that, she said something about not ruining this after all the trouble she went through." Benjamin inhaled deeply, turning back to Melissa. His once loving wife now looked like a cornered animal, desperate for an escape route. Cracks in the facade. Melissa shifted uncomfortably, her hands tightening around the strap of her purse. She was losing control, and she knew it. "This is insane," she said, forcing a dry laugh. "You can't seriously believe this little thief over your own wife." The murmur in the cafe grew louder. Waiters exchanged glances. Diners whispered to one another. It was clear that everyone was starting to see the cracks in her perfect image. Benjamin leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Melissa," he said slowly, his voice now carrying an unmistakable weight, "tell me the truth, right now." For a second, she hesitated, her lips parting as if she wanted to lie. But something in Benjamin's expression told her he wasn't going to let this go. And then her mask finally cracked. Her shoulders slumped just slightly, her eyes flashing with something between anger and resignation. "I can't believe you're doing this," she muttered, shaking her head. "After everything I've put up with, everything I've sacrificed for you." Benjamin's stomach turned. "Sacrificed?" he repeated, his voice hollow. Melissa let out a breath, her carefully composed demeanor slipping further. "You were never supposed to live past this year, Benjamin," she said, her voice low but deadly. "And I was supposed to inherit everything, but you just kept getting better. And She trailed off as she realized what she had just admitted. The cafe gasped in unison. A fork clattered to the floor. A waiter's hand trembled as he set down a tray. Jamal stared at her in disbelief, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what had just happened. Benjamin's realization, a long silence stretched between them before Benjamin finally spoke. His voice was softer now, but laced with something icy, something final. "You were trying to kill me." Melissa's lips pressed into a thin line, her body rigid with tension. For the first time since he had met her, she had nothing left to say. Benjamin exhaled, shaking his head. The betrayal cut deeper than he had expected. Then, without looking away from her, he nodded toward the waiter. "Call the police." The cafe erupted into motion. A waiter rushed inside. Patrons moved away from the table, whispering in stunned disbelief. Melissa's eyes darted to the exit, her body tensing like she was about to run. But before she could, Benjamin reached out, gripping her wrist with a surprising steadiness for a man his age. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "Not until we get to the bottom of this." For the first time in her life, Melissa had no control, no power, and no escape. And for the first time, Jamal realized that speaking up had made all the difference. As sirens blared in the distance, drawing closer, Benjamin turned to the young boy who had saved his life. "You did the right thing, son," he said softly, "and I won't forget it." The moment of exposure, Melissa's lies unravel. The tension inside Park Cafe was thick, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful but pregnant with anticipation, unease, and impending disaster. Melissa, once the picture of poise and elegance, now sat stiff and unmoving, her manicured fingers tightening around the strap of her designer handbag. Across from her, Benjamin Clark, 74, sat as still as a statue, his usual commanding presence now shadowed by something colder realization. And standing before them, small but unshaken, was Jamal, the young black boy who had shattered Melissa's carefully built facade. The restaurant was no longer just a place for the wealthy to indulge in their expensive meals. It had become a courtroom of silent witnesses, where every patron, every waiter, every set of eyes watched the drama unfold, waiting for the next revelation. Benjamin still hadn't touched his soup, his spoon resting on the edge of the porcelain bowl, as if mocking the very meal that had almost become his last. Jamal, his breath still unsteady from the sheer audacity of what he had done, refused to back down. "She put something in your soup," he repeated, this time with more control, his voice steady. "I saw her." Melissa's carefully cultivated charm fractured in an instant. She slammed her hand on the table, her expression hardening as her eyes darted toward the onlookers. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "He's lying. He's a street kid looking for attention." The room remained unconvinced. The murmurs had started low at first, then building a tide of doubt and suspicion rolling through the cafe. Benjamin, ever the businessman, had spent decades reading people, seeing through deception, uncovering truths hidden beneath layers of charm. And now he was seeing his wife in a way he never had before. The moment of hesitation. For years, Benjamin had believed in Melissa's loyalty. He had overlooked the late nights, the secrets, the occasional flashes of coldness behind her carefully polished smiles. He had brushed away the whispers of doubt. Why would she harm him? He had given her everything, but now he saw it: the fear, the calculation, the desperation. Melissa wasn't just angry, she was caught. Benjamin's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the spoon again, lifting it close to his face, but not yet taking a bite. Instead, he inhaled deeply, his mind racing. "Melissa," he said slowly, his voice dangerously calm, "tell me exactly why this boy would lie." Melissa blinked, her mouth opening slightly before snapping shut. She wasn't prepared for that question. She had expected outrage, expected him to dismiss Jamal's words without thought, but Benjamin wasn't doing that. He was analyzing. "Benjamin," she tried, her voice softening, almost pleading. "You can't possibly answer the question," he interrupted, his voice sharp. Why would he lie? Melissa floundered. The cafe watched, enthralled. Jamal, sensing that this was his moment to push forward, stepped closer to the table. His small frame cast a long shadow over the white tablecloth, the contrast between his ragged hoodie and Benjamin's tailored suit almost poetic. "Check the soup," Jamal said, his voice quiet but unwavering. "If you don't believe me, test it." A ripple of agreement moved through the onlookers. Benjamin's jaw tightened, his gaze flickering between the bowl and his wife. Melissa scoffed, attempting to regain her composure. "This is absurd," she said, shaking her head. "Why would I ever harm you?" The silence that followed was louder than any accusation, and in that silence, Benjamin finally understood the answer. The cracking of the facade. Melissa shifted in her seat, her back straight, rigid, her hands now folded neatly on the table. The panic was still there, just beneath the surface, but she was trying desperately to regain control. "Benjamin, think about this," she said, her voice lowering into a coaxing whisper. "You know me. You know I love you. Why would I ever do something so horrible?" It was a well-rehearsed act, one she had likely used many times before. But this time, it wasn't working. Benjamin leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The restaurant had fallen into complete silence, waiting for his next move. Then, without breaking eye contact with his wife, he raised his hand slightly. "Call the police." The collapse of a Lie collective gasp swept through the cafe. Melissa's face paled, her eyes widening just slightly before she forced a laugh, a high, unnatural sound that echoed painfully against the cafe walls. "Are you serious?" she hissed. "Benjamin, this is insane!" But Benjamin was done listening. The waiter, who had been frozen in place, now nodded hesitantly and hurried away to make the call. Melissa's eyes darted to the exits, and for the briefest moment she considered running. But before she could move, Benjamin's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a firmness that made her still. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm, unyielding. Jamal watched, his heart still pounding, his fists clenched at his sides. He had done what he came to do, now it was out of his hands. Melissa's final stand. The sirens were distant at first, a faint hum beneath the tense silence. Then they grew louder. Melissa, her breath quickening, her shoulders stiffening, glared at Jamal like he was the source of all her misfortune. "You have no idea what you've done," she seethed. "You just ruined everything." Jamal stared back, unshaken. "You did that yourself." Melissa exhaled sharply, shaking her head in frustration. "You think this makes you a hero?" she spat. "You're nothing but a street rat. What do you think you'll get out of this?" But before Jamal could respond, Benjamin did. Respect. Melissa whipped her head back toward her husband, her eyes wide with something close to betrayal. Benjamin simply stood from his chair, adjusting his cufflinks, looking every bit the powerful man he had always been. Only now he saw the truth. "Unlike you," he continued, "he did something honest today, and with that, the police arrived." Melissa's fate was sealed, and Jamal, for the first time in his life, had made a difference. The fall of Melissa, a moment of reckoning. The once lively hum of Park Cafe had dissolved into an eerie silence, broken only by the distant wail of approaching sirens. All eyes were locked on Melissa, whose once polished composure had begun to crack beyond repair. The woman who had effortlessly commanded attention with her flawless elegance and measured charm, now sat trapped, exposed, and powerless. Across from her, Benjamin Clark, 74 years old, had transformed in an instant from a wealthy, distracted businessman to a man staring betrayal in the face. His spoon still rested on the edge of the table, the steaming bowl of soup now a symbol of everything he had failed to see before this moment. And standing between them, Jamal, the young black boy who had dared to speak up, remained steadfast. His presence, once invisible to the wealthy patrons of Park Cafe, now carried the weight of truth. Melissa, realizing that her carefully constructed world was caving in, forced a laugh, a brittle, unconvincing sound that echoed against the marble floors. "You can't be serious, Benjamin," she scoffed, reaching for her glass of wine with hands that trembled just slightly. "You're really going to take the word of a street kid over your own wife?" But the crowd wasn't buying it. The whispers among the diners had grown into a steady murmur, their gazes bouncing between Melissa, Benjamin, and Jamal. The truth was already written across her face, in the tension in her shoulders, in the forced calm of her voice. Benjamin exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if the weight of the moment had finally settled on him. He had spent years trusting this woman, believing in her loyalty, showering her with luxury, devotion, and trust, and yet here they were. "Melissa," he said, his voice even but carrying an unmistakable finality, "tell me the truth." Melissa set down her wine glass a little too quickly, the sound sharp, unnatural. "The truth?" she repeated, scoffing. "The truth is that this is absurd. This child, this nobody just barged into our lunch with some ridiculous accusation. And now you're treating me like a criminal?" But Benjamin's gaze remained steady. "Then why won't you let them test the soup?" Melissa's lips parted slightly, as if trying to form an answer, but she had none. The cafe guests leaned in closer, the anticipation hanging thick in the air. The once distant sirens had grown louder, signaling that time was running out for Melissa to explain herself. Jamal, still standing firmly near the table, took a small step forward. "If you have nothing to hide," he said, his voice strong despite the slight tremor in his hands, "then let them check it." Melissa whipped her head toward him, her eyes burning with frustration, fear, and something dangerously close to hatred. "You think you've won something here?" she hissed. "You think they'll believe a nobody like you?" Jamal stood his ground. "They already do." Melissa's breath hitched. Because he was right, the room wasn't on her side anymore. Even the waiters, once so attentive to her every whim, now stood with their arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. And Benjamin, the man she had so easily manipulated for years, was no longer looking at her the same way. He saw her now, not as his beautiful, devoted wife, but as a liar, a fraud, a woman who had just tried to take his life. The arrival of justice, the double doors of the cafe swung open, and two uniformed police officers stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room. The sight of them sent a ripple of tension through the space. One of the waiters, who had been standing just outside the scene, stepped forward and pointed toward Benjamin's table. "Over there." Melissa's breath grew unsteady, her fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag, her nails digging into the leather. She was running out of time. The officers approached, their movements slow but deliberate. Everyone could feel what was about to happen. Benjamin, his expression tired but resolute, gestured toward the soup. "This young man says my wife tampered with my food," he said. "I want it tested." Melissa snapped. "Oh, for God's sake, Benjamin," she exploded, her voice rising. "Do you hear yourself? This is ridiculous. I am your wife." But even as she spoke, the panic was setting in. One of the officers met her gaze, unwavering. "Ma'am, we need you to step away from the table." Melissa let out a sharp breath, as if she were about to protest. But then she saw the way Benjamin was looking at her, not with love, not even with anger, but with something worse, disgust. And in that moment, she realized she had lost. Truly, irreversibly lost. As one officer reached for her arm, she jerked back, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't understand," she said, her voice dropping, her breath uneven. "I didn't have a choice." But she did, and she had made the wrong one. Jamal watched as the officers escorted Melissa out, her once impeccable posture now reduced to something small and defeated. The cafe guests, who had been spellbound by the spectacle, began murmuring amongst themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered about how they always had a feeling something was off about her. But for Jamal, none of that mattered. He had done what he came to do, and as he turned toward Benjamin, the billionaire's sharp eyes softened just slightly. For the first time in his life, Jamal had changed someone's fate. And maybe, just maybe, his own was about to change too. A new beginning, gratitude and second chances. As the police escorted Melissa out of Park Cafe, the once elegant woman barely lifted her head, her carefully curated image shattered beyond repair. The hushed murmurs of the wealthy patrons followed her like a ghost, whispers of shock, betrayal, and disbelief spreading across the restaurant. Just minutes ago, she had been the polished, poised wife of a billionaire. Now, she was nothing more than a criminal exposed, a woman undone by her own greed. At the center of it all, Benjamin Clark, 74, sat motionless, his hand resting on the table beside the untouched bowl of poisoned soup. A man who had built an empire, forged his way through the ruthless world of business, and accumulated wealth beyond measure, had failed to see the deception that had been living under his own roof. And then there was Jamal, the young black boy who had changed the course of an afternoon, and perhaps a life. For years, Jamal had been a shadow, a presence that people ignored, dismissed, or avoided. But today, in a moment of courage, he had stepped forward, spoken up, and made himself seen. He had done what many others wouldn't have dared. He had intervened when it mattered most. Benjamin slowly turned to him, his eyes no longer filled with suspicion, but with something softer, something deeper: respect, gratitude, and perhaps a tinge of guilt. "You saved my life," Benjamin finally said, his voice quieter than before but resolute. "And I don't even know your name." Jamal hesitated, shifting slightly on his feet. He wasn't used to direct attention, let alone from a billionaire who moments ago had been ready to dismiss him as just another street kid. "Jamal," he said finally, his voice steady but quiet. "My name's Jamal." Benjamin nodded slowly, letting the name settle in his mind. He had spent decades making calculated decisions, investing in the right people, knowing who to trust and who to avoid. And yet, today, the person who had saved him was the one person society overlooked the most. He studied Jamal, noticing for the first time the weariness in his eyes, the thinness of his frame, the way his oversized hoodie barely clung to his small body. This was a child who had seen too much, struggled too long, and yet, despite his own hardships, he had chosen to save another. Benjamin took a deep breath, his sharp business instincts giving way to something more human: empathy. "Where are you staying tonight?" he asked. Jamal blinked, caught off guard by the question. He hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know, wherever I can." Benjamin exhaled slowly, nodding as if he had already made up his mind. "That won't do." Jamal frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Benjamin pushed his chair back and stood to his full height, the same commanding presence he had in business meetings and boardrooms, now directed at something far more personal. "I mean, you're coming with me." Jamal stiffened, his instinct telling him to be wary. He had learned long ago not to trust promises from rich men. "I don't want anything," Jamal said quickly. "I didn't do this for money." Benjamin gave him a knowing look. "I know, that's why I want to help you." Jamal stared at him for a long moment, his mind racing. For the first time in years, someone saw him not as a problem, not as a nuisance, but as a person. And maybe, just maybe, his life was about to change. A second chance. The beginning of a new chapter. As the evening sun dipped below the skyline, Park Cafe slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The murmurs of shocked patrons had softened, conversations resumed, and the clinking of silverware once again filled the air. But for Benjamin Clark and Jamal, nothing would ever be the same. For the first time in his 74 years, Benjamin had been forced to confront his own vulnerability, not in the form of financial risk or corporate betrayal, but in something far more personal. He had spent his life trusting numbers, contracts, and investments, yet he had failed to see the deception of the person closest to him. And in contrast, it had been Jamal, a boy whom society overlooked, who had stepped forward and saved him. Now, as the reality of what had transpired settled in, Benjamin turned to Jamal, studying him with a newfound sense of clarity. He no longer saw just a homeless kid in tattered clothes, but a boy with courage, integrity, and a strength beyond his years. "You did something today that most people wouldn't have," Benjamin said, his voice calm but firm. "You saw something wrong, and you spoke up. That took guts." Jamal shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise, let alone from someone like Benjamin. "I just did what was right," he muttered. Benjamin nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "That's exactly why I want to help you." Jamal's eyes flickered with hesitation. He had spent years relying on himself, learning not to trust the promises of strangers. "I don't want anything," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't do it for a reward." Benjamin leaned back in his chair, studying him for a moment before responding. "I know." And that's why you deserve one. A pause stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. You don't have to live like this anymore, Jamal, Benjamin continued. If you'll let me, I'd like to give you a fresh start. For the first time in years, Jamal felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. And maybe, just maybe, this was the moment that would change his life forever. The power of doing what's right, a lesson in courage and integrity. Life often presents us with moments where we must choose between staying silent or speaking up, between walking away or taking a stand. These moments may not always seem monumental, but they define who we are and what we stand for. The story of Jamal and Benjamin Clark teaches us that doing what is right is not always easy, but it is always important. Jamal was just a boy, someone that most people ignored, a face in the crowd, unnoticed and unimportant in the eyes of society. Yet, when he saw something wrong, when he realized that someone's life was in danger, he did not hesitate. He spoke up. He risked his own safety, his own dignity, and even his own future to save a man who would have never given him a second glance on any other day. How many times in life do we see something unjust and look the other way? How often do we convince ourselves that it's not our business, that someone else will step in, or that it's not worth the trouble? Yet, time and again, history and experience show us that it is the small acts of courage, the seemingly insignificant decisions, that shape the course of lives and even the world. Benjamin Clark had spent his life building an empire, trusting only facts, figures, and business acumen. He had learned to judge people by their net worth and social status, never expecting that his greatest lesson in trust would come from a homeless boy, someone he would have once dismissed as nothing more than a nuisance. But in his moment of greatest vulnerability, it was not his wealth, his power, or his success that saved him. It was the bravery of a child who had nothing to gain. There is something deeply profound in that. It reminds us that the value of a person is not measured by their money or their title, but by their character. It teaches us that wisdom is not always found in boardrooms or books, but often in the hearts of those who have lived through hardship and still choose kindness. For those in their later years, this lesson is even more poignant. We have seen the world change, watched people come and go, experienced both kindness and betrayal. And yet, the fundamental truth remains: doing the right thing never goes out of style. We may not always have the opportunity to save a life, but we have countless opportunities to offer kindness, to stand up for what is just, to speak truth when it is needed most. Whether it is helping a neighbor, mentoring the younger generation, or simply offering a listening ear, we can all be like Jamal in some way. Because in the end, it is not wealth or success that defines a legacy, it is the courage to do what is right, even when no one is watching.